Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 95. We're closing in on that nice big number, and next week is the first of the revised Patreon Drydock, so I guess we'll see how all that goes. Anyway, questions this week are taken from the video on the Fubuki class destroyers, Guide 135, and the appropriately matching special on Wednesday about the A6M0 Japanese naval fighter. Angelo Morte 1 asks, were the Italian torpedo boats like the Spica class worth it? So the Spica class, for those of you who don't know what they are one of the many attempts to rules lawyer your way around the restrictions of the various naval treaties, much as how the initial Washington Treaty had defined an aircraft carrier as above 10,000 tons, so the Japanese promptly tried to build Ryuho at less than 10,000 tons, and then ended up building it massively over, but never mind. The Spica class were pretty much the same kind of thing. The treaties also said that boats of under 600 tons were fine. There was no limit to building them. And so the Italians decided to build a bunch of torpedo boats that were under 600 tons. And much like Ryuho, ended up building the things, well overweight for a 600-ton weight limit. They were about 750 tons normal displacement, and by the time they're actually loaded, pushing close to 1,000, which made them still quite small for the time compared to the destroyers of the period, but still not quite the 600-ton torpedo boats they were advertised at. Nonetheless, if it had been any other navy, I would say definitely not. If they'd been built for the Germans or the British, they would never have survived very long in the North Sea. Certainly at the speeds they were trying to operate at. The Japanese and the Americans would have had the major problem of the fact they just couldn't go very far. So they would have restricted them to basically home defence only. But for the Italians, who had to operate basically in the Mediterranean and almost nowhere else, they were fine. The short range didn't matter too much in the close confines of the Mediterranean. For a navy like Italy, which was trying to play on the top level playing field but with something like a 4th or 5th tier budget, then they definitely made a lot of sense, because you could get a lot more of them for your money. And as I said, they circumvented the treaty limits, even if they did lie somewhat about the displacement. And when you look at their wartime performance, they certainly turned in a creditable one. I mean, as you might expect in such a cauldron as the Mediterranean, very small torpedo boat-destroyer ships, such as the Spicas, did suffer somewhat of a horrendous attrition rate. Other destroyers that were of a more normal displacement, as well as cruisers, could basically feed on them for free XP at any given moment. But they certainly punched back against quite a number of different targets. They damaged cruisers, sunk destroyers, sunk merchant shipping and submarines. And as far as the Italian Navy is concerned, they also formed relatively useful convoy escorts. Again, they're not really able to take the fight fully to Allied attack groups when they showed up in large numbers. But the Italians were never going to have enough destroyers and cruisers to run the convoys that they needed to run into North Africa in such numbers that they could challenge the Royal Navy sending in destroyer flotillas and cruiser squadrons after them. But with these things under their belt, the Italians were able to maintain the needed numbers, at least, of escorts for the convoys, and at the end of the day, they have torpedo launchers, so you can't ignore them. You have to try and deal with them. And so, between that and their anti-aircraft capabilities, they did save quite a number of convoys and quite a number of merchant ships. So, I'd say for the resources invested in them, for the Italian Navy specifically, they were probably a pretty good value for money. They certainly saw a lot more use than the ridiculously expensive Littorios did later on. And of course, being small, they didn't have that much fuel requirement, which was also a useful thing later on. David Connor asks, is it true that the Japanese Navy alone was capable of torpedo reloads at sea? And if so, please go through the process. Well, the simple answer is no. Almost any ship that carries torpedoes is capable of reloading them at sea, and There are various accounts, both official, semi-official and unofficial, that various navies did actually do this. Destroyers in particular, not really surprising considering destroyers tend to attract the most aggressive commanders. However, if your ship isn't designed to be able to reload at sea, you're gonna have a fair number of issues, ranging from the fact that torpedoes are actually quite heavy, so if you're carrying reloads for any substantial number of torpedo launchers, then if you've got several dozen tons of torpedoes crammed somewhere on your main deck, it's probably going to do some fairly nasty things to your ship's stability unless your ship is ridiculously stable to start with, or was designed with a lot of spare capability in that regard. Plus, they're also fairly large, so they take up a fair bit of space, especially on a destroyer, not so much on a cruiser, but that's going to be quite difficult to find somewhere to safely store them. Well, store them, period, let alone safely. And then, of course, finally, torpedoes are very heavy, so without specialised equipment, which obviously would be installed if you're expecting to reload them, you're going to have to either jury-rig something or rely on brute force and ignorance, either of which is going to be a relatively slow and exposed procedure. Now, the Japanese actually had two primary ways of reloading their torpedoes at sea on their destroyers, one of which only showed up on the Fubuki class and was not quite as efficient, but the main one, which they used on a number of destroyer classes and some other vessels, can be seen just about in detail on something like this, which is a model of a Kagero class. Now, if you look just to, as far as we're concerned, the left-hand side of the forward funnel, which is the starboard side of the ship, you can see that behind the funnel there is one of the torpedo launchers, and just next to the funnel is this weird box shape that perhaps on a more modern ship might be an Exocet launcher or a harpoon launcher or something. That box actually contains torpedoes, and there'll be a couple of others scattered about the deck. And you can see they kind of just about line up with the torpedo launchers. So the idea here is that when the torpedoes that are in the tubes are launched, the launcher positions itself to face this box, and then the torpedoes can be relatively quickly and easily run out of the box on the rails that are built into it, straight into the torpedo launcher, and then you are ready to go, primed to launch pretty quickly. So this is the main difference. Apart from the stability and storage issues we outlined before, it's the sheer speed. The Japanese destroyers are able to reload their torpedoes, if they need to, within minutes, and then they can go back into action. So in their theoretical big night battle against the US Navy, they can duck in, fire torpedoes, and then swing back out to avoid return fire, and probably by the time they've completed a full 360, they'll have their torpedo tubes reloaded for another go. Whereas if you are not equipped with such a system, and you want to reload, and you don't want to lose your reloading crew and possibly the torpedoes to murderous deck fire, then you need to go get out of contact, and you need probably, I'd say, if you're being generous, 15 to 20 minutes, probably longer, to reload. Obviously depends on the kind of launcher you've got. If you've got a triple launcher, it might be a bit faster than if you've got a quintuple launcher. It's going to take a lot longer, and also things like sea state and such are going to affect it. Mark Kim asks, if the Dutch 1047 battle cruisers had actually been completed, do you think it would have affected the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies in a significant way? Affected, yes. Prevented, no. And probably not in a good way for the 1047s, to be perfectly honest. The 1047s were designed in a period when air power was not... Well, at the time, it wasn't enough to overthrow major fleets, and it certainly wasn't appreciated that in the near future it would be able to do so. So the idea of the 1047s was effectively not that they could stop the Imperial Japanese Navy from attacking the Dutch East Indies, because 3 or 4 of them versus the entire Japanese Navy, that was never going to end well. But by posing a threat that was sufficient to quite handily deal with any cruisers the Japanese sent after the Dutch East Indies, or it maybe even an escort of 1 or 2 of the Congos, it would force the Japanese, if they did want to attack the Dutch East Indies, to think about sending a much larger force. So you'd have to send maybe the entire Congo class, and or several battleships, etc. And with the fact that the Japanese really knew that they would have to face off against the Americans or the British, or possibly both, it would look like too much of a risk. Because when you look at where the Dutch East Indies are, well, the Japanese kind of proved this point. If they were going to go after them, they'd have to go through either, well, certainly the Philippines and possibly also some British holdings, which would mean one, possibly both of the world's biggest navies would be gunning for them. Japan would be outnumbered at that point, so they'd need every ship they could spare. So risking sending in ships that could potentially be lost against a force of 1047s might not be worth it. Because even if they manage to overwhelm them and take the Dutch East Indies, if they lose one or two ships, or maybe have one destroyed and another few heavily damaged in the process of taking out the Dutch fleet in the East Indies, that's going to represent maybe 10, 15, 20% effective combat force of their fleet gone, in a fleet that's already going to be probably outnumbered by the incoming other attacks. So that might tip the balance in the Japanese mind of whether or not they can win that fight. And so therefore the conclusion will be, we won't attack the Dutch East Indies. Now obviously by the time war actually broke out in the Pacific at the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, aircraft had advanced considerably, and so unfortunately the single most likely outcome of the 1047s being present in our timeline would have been for the Japanese to send in a massive airstrike and just sink them that way, which would have been a bit unfortunate for them, but it would have delayed the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, because even if the Japanese had decided they were going to go down that route, then they would have to gather enough force to pull off that airstrike, which would mean carriers, and because the 1047s are fast, that would also mean a fairly heavy carrier escort, and then you send in the aircraft and hopefully destroy everything, and if not, send in the battleships to mop up. But as I say, to gather that force, it would have delayed the Japanese invasion quite considerably while they built it up, and possibly delayed it still further, because if the Japanese build up that kind of major task force and suddenly somebody else shows up elsewhere, more important strategic concerns, etc., they might have to divert that force away. So it could definitely delay it, but at the end of the day, the Japanese wanted that oil, so they were going to come one way or the other. Doug Gallagher asks, in the Royal Navy, why did the British never quite standardise upon main gun and secondary gun battery sizes? Given that they had 14, 15 and 16-inch main guns, secondaries 4, 4.5, 4.7, 5.25, possibly more, whilst the US had 16-inch after the standards, albeit in different marks and calibers, and the 5-inch 38 after the 5-inch 25. Since it seems to make no sense in logistics and ballistics to have such a wide and varied area of armaments to train with, why did this occur? So I have answered this in part in some other questions, so I will be relatively brief here and focus on the bit that I haven't talked about so much before, which is the main batteries. The answer to the main batteries is effectively budgetary considerations. Vanguard, of course, was designed with 15-inch guns because those guns were quickly available. The Royal Navy did not want the 14-inch gun. The Royal Navy wanted, if you look at the design specs that they produced at various points during the treaty period up to the design of the King George V, the Royal Navy wanted a 16-inch gunship. If they couldn't have that, then they would settle for a 15-inch gunship, both of which would allow for a relative amount of standardization across the fleet, considering that, well, everything in the fleet at that point had 15-inch guns except for Rodney and Nelson. Although, as you say, as with the US, it would have had different lengths of barrel and weights of shell, etc. The reason they got stuck with a 14-inch gun on the King George V was because, for mostly economy reasons, the British government was pushing for a 14-inch gun at the various naval treaty negotiations, with some support from the Admiralty, although I get the impression, looking through various documents, that this was more forced by the economy measures being imposed on the Navy than what the admirals actually wanted. And they had this sort of slightly odd idea that if we are pushing for 14-inch guns as a caliber limit, then we better start designing our ships with 14-inch guns to show that we're not trying to do an end run around the treaty, when almost everyone else was doing end runs around the treaty, and they knew it, but never mind. So yeah, that's why you ended up with the 14-inch guns on the King George V. Remember, one of the more advanced designs prior to the final one being settled on was a design with triple 15s. And to say that there were pre-King George V designs and early King George V designs that looked at a 16-inch gun as well. The Lions, of course, were going to have 16-inch weapons, so if the Royal Navy had got its way, it would have been an all 15 and 16-inch gun fleet. And it's just circumstance they ended up with 14. Now, as for the secondaries, it comes from a wide variety of things. So the 4-inch is pretty much a dedicated anti-aircraft weapon by the time of the Second World War. There are some destroyers with 4-inch guns, but they tend to be the older ones. The 4.7-inch was an attempt at a heavy dual-purpose weapon for obviously being good at anti-surface and anti-air roles at a time when it was thought that it would be mounted on ships that would be defending other ships from air assault, and so the size and weight of the gun and the amount of recoil, because it's a long barrel weapon, that meant that it was very difficult to elevate it much past 40 degrees without some unorthodox work, meant that you would end up with this sort of 4.7-inch weapon that was actually very good at anti-surface activities, just as it turned out not quite as good at dealing with the close-in target-everything air paradigm that World War II kicked out. The 5.25 was a similar thing. It was an attempt to get a heavy dual-purpose anti-aircraft weapon and anti-surface weapon, but this time focusing around the battleships, where it was felt that something below of sort of 4.7 or below maybe wasn't quite heavy enough, and then obviously imported onto the Didos as well. The 4.5 was really the way forward, because the 4.5 was found to be fast enough firing and accurate enough to be a very useful anti-surface weapon and a pretty decent anti-aircraft weapon as well. So the 4.5 ticked the same kind of boxes that the 5-inch 38 ticked in the US Navy, but the 4.5 was developed relatively late on, at least in the caliber for the particular models that we're talking about, and so when the Royal Navy went in, it had 4-inch guns on the older destroyers and the dedicated 4-inch AA weapon, which would be broadly role-wise similar to the 5.25 on American ships. And it then had the 4.7s and the 5.25s from kind of the early to mid-1930s developments, trying to go for dual-purpose weapons. And then you had the 4.5s, which I say were the way forward. And unfortunately, because of various manufacturing limitations, it meant that you couldn't very rapidly standardize on one particular caliber because of the interruption in production, etc. So you had to keep producing certain types of guns because you could at least have guns that way. And so you ended up with some of these guns having a bit of a longer tail legacy than ideally would have been wanted, and certainly a longer tail legacy than they would have had the Second World War not happened. But through the war, you gradually see a kind of a standardization of caliber centering around, at least for in the secondary roles, around the 4.5-inch gun. The sort of N class and such, like battle class, and obviously later the Darings, are all carrying the 4.5 inch as their main weapon for destroyers. The 4.5 is, of course, the standard dual-purpose weapon of the aircraft carriers. It's fitted to all the rebuilt Royal Navy warships, the Queen Elizabeth, the Valiant, the Renown. It probably would have also equipped the Hood had it gone in for refit, etc. Obviously, yes, they stuck 4.5s on the Didos when they couldn't get enough 5.25s, and this was a little bit of a. The Didos were a little bit of a weird one because the Didos were primarily designed around anti-aircraft defense as well as taking out destroyers and torpedo boats, for which the 4.5 would actually be a lot better. But because they were cruisers, there was also the possibility they might end up on detached duty or even within fleet duty at fending off other cruisers, at which point it was felt the 4.5 or the 4.7 at the time wasn't quite enough to take on cruisers. And so the 6-inch wasn't really going to be working out as a dual-purpose gun pre-World War II, so the 5.25 was used at that point because of those reasons. Stefan Pajung asks, what happened to the Danish warships the Royal Navy quote-unquote liberated at Copenhagen in 1807? The Royal Navy usually put captured French and Spanish warships into service again, but I can't find anything about the Royal Navy using the Danish ships apart from a few frigates. What happened to the ships of the line? So, most of the ships of the line were also taken into Royal Navy service. Some of them were disposed of as being too badly damaged or not really worth using. But one of the things you've got to keep in mind when you're looking at these kinds of things is the type of ship that is captured. The Royal Navy, when it comes to third-rate ships of the line, is kind of settled on the 74, although, as I've mentioned in other Age of Sail related videos, just because it's rated at 74 guns doesn't mean it's actually carrying 74 guns. Almost everyone was carrying a lot more guns than their ships are actually rated for, but nevertheless, using the rated armament is actually a good way of establishing approximate size. Now, in this respect, the British were kind of in the middle of the pack. They needed ocean-going ships, which obviously had to be relatively large, but they preferred them to be relatively sturdy and relatively agile, and so they settled on the 74. The French, and to a lesser extent the Spanish, but mainly the French, preferred speed, and so for speed a longer hull form is better, and this is why you end up with the French 80s. Now this made them very fast, it made them look very nice, and it made them very big, but they were nowhere near as durable and nowhere near as suitable for long distance ocean cruising. So whilst their size and firepower made them very attractive commands once captured and put into Royal Navy service for Royal Navy officers, they did require inordinate amounts of maintenance. At the lower end of things, when it came to the third rates, were the smaller navies like the Dutch, the Danish, etc., etc. And this was because, well, they didn't need full oceanic going navies. They needed one or two ships that were capable of doing that when it came to ships of the line, but mostly they needed ships that could carry a decent number of guns to defend their more local interests. And so when you look at the list of Danish ships, you'll see there are a few that are in the high 70s, low 80s in terms of rated gun power, but quite a few are 74s or 70s, and a number of that are rated in the 60s. And this reflects basically the main problem that the Royal Navy had, even though it took most of the captured Danish fleet into its own service, was that the Danish ships were fairly capable in and of themselves, but they were not designed for long-range operations. And the Royal Navy, trying to obviously conduct a long-range global war, had issues trying to keep them operational and supplied. And so they overall tended not to last too long in Royal Navy service. I mean, that there were also material issues in terms of how well they'd been maintained and how much damage they'd taken, etc., when they were actually brought into the Navy, but that's a separate matter. So, yeah, effectively, they were in service with the Royal Navy, but they had limited uses. So the Royal Navy tended to keep them a bit closer to home, put them on second-line duties, and so they don't get written about quite as much as the bigger stuff. And with the War of 1812, forcing a crash-building program as well as the natural advancement of naval technology, the Royal Navy ended up building, and thanks to the French also capturing, large numbers of much bigger ships that were much more suited for long-range oceanic operations in the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars, and so they ended up actually with more ships than they could realistically man, and so unfortunately, smaller ships that couldn't really project force over long distances without inordinate numbers of stops to resupply tended to go on the chopping block pretty quickly. Rafal 1981 asks, having seen the video about the Battle of Lissa makes me wonder, how was it possible for SMS Kaiser to lose most of her bow and still remain afloat? Well, here she is. Try and work out which end is for the front end. A little bit flattened. But anyway, so there are two reasons why Kaiser was able to remain afloat. And as you can see, actually, I'll give you a clue, the bow was on the right-hand side. Actually adopt something of an upward attitude was because, one, the bow on wooden ships of the line, even at this late stage, was to a relatively great extent more a case of ornamentation, bowsprit support and hydrodynamics, and less an issue of lesser factor in when it comes to things like watertight integrity. If you look at the plans of Age of Sail ships of the line, what you'll notice is an awful lot of them seem to have what look like awfully blunt bows when the drawings are showing the structural elements. The sort of nice pointed bow that we tend to associate is largely additional structure beyond that. It's not part of the central structure of the wooden ship itself. And so you can lose that. You're going to lose a lot of speed, but you can lose that. And, well, as you can see, Kaiser actually floats slightly more, ironically enough. The other factor is, well, wooden ships are actually ridiculously hard to sink. Easy to set on fire, but very hard to sink because wood tends to float. Now, admittedly, stuff like cannon and other things on board don't, but overall, unless you really, really chuck in a load of water, these things tend to stay afloat regardless of the amount of physical punishment you throw at them. Again, especially at this late stage, because at this point, unlike, say, if we're talking about ships in the late 1700s, i.e. the late 18th century, these ships actually had, to a certain degree, bulkheads and as well as significantly more volume, etc. So losing most of your prow or bow and just having a bit of your forward structure, main structure of your ship caved in, as long as your basic bulkhead's underwater held, you weren't going to end up with your bow dipping down quite as significantly or as quickly as you would with a steel or iron ship. At which point, well, as you can see here, the gun decks, it doesn't actually matter if they're open air at that end because no water's coming in. You've just got to worry about fixing up the lower section, ensuring up the water tightness of the bulkhead down there, and maybe constructing some kind of cofferdam around the broken in section. And this is the other handy thing, is that wood, when it's a bit broken in and smashed and gets wet, tends to expand and swell. So between that and the supplies you carry on board, you can usually make something of a useful cofferdam and break. And then you just sail backwards, or if you've got a particular amount of faith in the strength of your repair work and the bulkheads you have in your holds, just keep going forwards. Isaac Solomon asks, how effective were 50 cal and 20mm guns mounted on aircraft against ships, specifically against logistical ships and light warships? How many ships were sunk purely from aircraft gun weaponry? It depends entirely on the ship in question. There is a huge difference between merchant shipping and warships, even if the merchant ship is considerably larger. And even light warships, when you get much above, say, a medium-sized destroyer, there is a certain amount of armour present. Even if it's not rated as armour for ship-to-ship purposes, the plating on, say, a large destroyer is easily, well, not to say easily, but certainly capable of turning a 50 cal. Obviously on smaller destroyers and destroyers that have been lightly built, that's not so much the case, but even they had spaces that could be proofed against 50 cal weapons. 20mm maybe not so much. but obviously you tend to have fewer 20mm guns than you do machine guns on a given aircraft. And once you get above that into the realm of light cruisers, well, they've definitely got armour over their vital spaces that can take both 50 cal and 20mm fire. And of course, warships tend to shoot back, which somewhat degrades the amount of gun ammunition you can throw at them from an aircraft if you don't like being on fire. Now, when it comes to merchant shipping, that's a lot more vulnerable. Merchant shipping, the hull plating tends to be built basically to how thick do we need it to keep the water out and stop the ship from snapping in half and not a millimetre thicker. And there tends to be a lot fewer crew on board for damage control, and, well, a lot of the time they tend to be carrying cargoes that are either flammable or explosive or possibly both. And, yeah, so if you're strafing a merchant ship, or indeed a submarine, submarines, of course, needing their watertight integrity to stay down and not being famed for their armour plating, those kinds of targets you could pretty badly mess up with a mixture of 50 cal and 20mm fire. Submarines especially, light merchant ships as well, especially if you manage to set them on fire with your 20mm ammunition, maybe 50 cal incendiaries. But except for the submarine element, even when you're talking about any merchant shipping, anything larger than a fishing trawler or something, you would almost certainly be talking more about the damage done through secondary effects such as fire, killing crew, knocking out systems, and that would add up to sink the ship and possibly fire and explosions from onboard equipment. You wouldn't generally be able to knock enough holes in any substantial size ship just with this kind of gunfire to actually sink it outright. But so you could sink it with the secondary effects of such equipment, such gunfire. Light warships, destroyers, torpedo boats, such like, yes, you could, but bombs and torpedoes are much better at it. To a certain extent, the same kind of factors apply. Could you hit a vital system? Obviously, if with a warship, could you hit an ammunition section, or could you kill enough men? Could you set it on fire? But warships are much better equipped to deal with those issues, both in terms of damage control and in terms of just resisting the fire in the first place. In terms of how many ships were sunk purely from aircraft gun weaponry, it's difficult to quantify. But it was certainly there was certainly a fair number, mostly on the merchant side of things. But this is the thing, it's difficult to quantify because there are quite a lot of attacks where multiple weapons are involved, because whilst you can sink ships using this kind of fire alone, it's very hit and miss and not particularly reliable. So the kinds of aircraft that are coming in with heavy 20mm and 50 cal gun arm are also coming in with rockets, bombs, torpedoes, bigger guns as well, recoilless guns, 40mm, etc. And so when they let loose, it's a case of, well, what exactly causes this ship to sink? Is it purely the light caliber gunfire? Or is it perhaps that combined with the shock effects of a near-miss bomb if the bomb didn't hit, and so on and so forth? So whilst there are quite a number of ships, say particularly merchant vessels, that are recorded as sunk by aircraft gunfire, exactly how many are attributable to these specific weapon systems is not something that's easily answered without quite the in-depth study. Mikko Leitinen asks, how did the Zero fare as a kamikaze plane? Also, kamikazes in general, what planes were the most devastating? Well, whilst often credited to a Zero, this particular little incident on the belt armour of HMS Sussex is not in fact a Zero. It's a completely different plane, although it is made also by Mitsubishi. But yeah, this kind of illustrates the fate of a lot of Zeros used as kamikaze planes, if somewhat hilariously. Now, to get into a little bit more detail, as a kamikaze aircraft, the Zero wasn't the best. It was relatively lightweight, as was covered in the video with Justin. It had an annoying tendency to lock up its controls at high speeds in dives, and a high-speed dive was one of the two most effective kamikaze approach profiles, and, well, if your controls lock up at the last minute, you're probably going to miss. It's also not obviously as durable as some other Japanese aircraft, so it can be picked apart more easily by incoming anti-aircraft fire. And its payload is not that great, because you've got to remember, it's like, yes, it's an aircraft, but aircraft are relatively squishy, as can be seen here, as compared to anything made of particularly solid materials. And so the effect of the kamikazes was more to do with the bombs or other explosive charges later on, when you got things like the Cherry Blossom suicide missile that they were carrying, more so than the aircraft itself. Really, when it came to kamikazes, unless you're going after something like a troop transport or a merchant ship or something like that, which didn't have any real protection in and of itself, if you're going after warships, there were only two real points of attack that were effective for kamikazes. One of which was, as I say, the very steep angled dive straight down, where you're effectively acting as the human guidance system for the bomb or bombs you might be carrying, and at that point you're trying to smash through the deck to deliver your payload deep into the heart of the ship. The other option is to come in low and almost horizontal, maybe with a bit of a dive to get speed up, and to hit as close to the waterline as possible, punch through the side of the ship, and if you can explode, then yes, obviously great, fantastic, but at that point you still have at least punched a big hole in the side of the ship, and that lets in water, and water is not good. Now, this latter approach is pretty effective against destroyers, who don't deal very well with big holes in the sides of the ship and also don't carry a significant amount of armour, but as you can see here, it's less effective against cruisers and battleships and such like, who do tend to carry a fair bit of armour on their sides to resist incoming high-speed projectiles that are considerably more durable than the average kamikaze. So if you're going after the big targets, and especially the carriers, and extra especially the American carriers, who have these nice big hangars full of explosives and burnables, you really want to go into the high-speed dives where, as I say, it's the Zero's not the world's best in a dive. Almost anything else is better. At that point, converted dive bombers, which are designed for this kind of thing, obviously are very good, and they're being a little bit bigger, they can also soak up a bit more punishment and probably carrying a bit heavier payload as well. A lot of kamikazes actually end up wasting themselves compared to what they could have done by coming in at relatively shallow dive angles, or if they're coming in horizontal, coming in higher up, aiming for things like the superstructure or the main deck. And whilst these strikes can cause a lot of casualties, they're very unlikely to actually significantly endanger the ship, unless, of course, it's a carrier and you punch through into the hangar and set things on fire, because they just don't have the speed. They're fast, they're kamikaze aircraft, but compared to the speed that a semi-armor piercing or armor piercing bomb might get up to if you lob it from the correct altitude, they're not coming in with this sufficient kinetic energy to, at those kind of angles, to punch through deck or side protection. And ultimately, even if you do set fire to the superstructure or whatever, unless the damage control crews are completely useless, you're not threatening the integrity of the ship. And on to some Patreon questions. So Bill Luster asks, have you read The Kamikaze Hunters by Will Iredale? What are your thoughts on the Fleet Air Arms transition in personnel and equipment when it moved from Europe to the Pacific during World War II? So, no, I haven't had a chance to read The Kamikaze Hunters yet. Both between my own purchases and very kind donations by subscribers, I have a very long reading list. So, yeah, I think it's on there somewhere. But anyway, what are my thoughts on the Fleet Air Arms transition in personnel and equipment when it moved to the Pacific? In a lot of ways, both for Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Navy, the shift to the Pacific and the formation of the British Pacific Fleet was pretty much the first chance the Royal Navy had had to draw breath since effectively the start of the war. I mean, if you think about it in terms of major Royal Navy commitments, from 1939 onwards, it had been convoys Norway, Dunkirk, Mediterranean, plus more convoys, Torch, Sicily, Salerno, D-Day. And so by the time they got to 1944, as I say, it was basically the first time they'd had an opportunity to go, right, let's do this in a properly organised way, because particularly with your question talking about the Fleet Air Arm, everything had been kind of ad hoc. The Fleet Air Arm had only just gotten back into Royal Navy control just before the Second World War. They had ideas of what they wanted. Then they had war breakout. They had those lessons actually pretty quickly turned around. And they knew what they wanted very quickly. I mean, within the first 3 or 4 months of the war, what the Royal Navy had actually asked for was something that a derivative of a Spitfire that looked like the unholy fusion of what would obviously later become the F4U Corsair and a Spitfire. But whilst it was possible, the whole thing had the kibosh put on it by the need to produce Spitfires for the upcoming Battle of Britain. So unfortunately, a properly carrier-capable Spit or Seafire was not to be, but never mind. And then after that, it was a case of, well, you got the Fulmar, throw the Fulmar into the fray. Okay, that's all right, but it's not working as best as we hoped. And then scrambling to get Sea Hurricanes, Seafires, Martlets, Wildcats, etc., etc. Just basically throwing things in as quickly as possible, and the same with the carriers. If they got damaged, get them repaired as quickly as possible, get them out there. With the British Pacific Fleet, when they had a chance to actually go, right, now we don't need this, we do need this, let's start standardising around certain types of aircraft. It's in some ways a huge relief for the Royal Navy, because not only does it allow them to put together their single largest coherent force since the start of the war, but it also allows them to deploy pretty much the full range of modern equipment that they've got. And that is it's still quite the mix, but it's a mix of both British and American types. So you've got the Barracuda, the Firefly, and the Seafire. For example, they're representing British industry, but you've also got various Cats, plus the Avenger and the Corsair present, which obviously came from the USA. And it also gives the Royal Navy a chance to try out a lot of the lessons that it's learned from the war so far. So lessons about anti-aircraft support, lessons about how to organise airstrikes, lessons about how to operate multiple groups of ships together, anti-submarine warfare, and all of this. So yeah, the Fleet Air Arm is able to suddenly become a lot more effective, especially also because now they're going to the Pacific, they're able to count on deck parking. So there are some issues to overcome with that, which obviously would require a much more extensive video to discuss. But overall, the formation of the British Pacific Fleet and that journey out is the first time that the Royal Navy gets a chance, especially the Fleet Air Arm, to practice what it thought it was going to be able to do at the start of 1939, and then wasn't able to do because everybody had the irritating habit of declaring war on them every 5 minutes. Brian Smith asks, who had more ships left at the end of World War II, Japan or Germany? I think you'll find, at least in terms of larger ships, it was actually the Germans, believe it or not. Going into 1945, the Japanese still, if you group together all surviving Japanese warships at the start of 1945 against all surviving German warships, the Japanese definitely have an advantage. For one thing, they still had a number of battleships still afloat. But whilst 1945 was not a particularly good year for the Kriegsmarine, it was very, very much a bad year to be a ship flying the rising sun. Theoretically, Nagato, Haruna, etc., all still present at the start. The none too kind attentions of the US Navy and later the British Pacific Fleet, which obviously we were just talking about, kind of reduced those down a bit. Whilst there were theoretically a few battleship hulls and carrier hulls, etc., and even a few cruisers found locked away in various harbours and docks, they were basically all either sunk at their moorings or otherwise inoperable. And destroyers quite similarly. With the Germans, although they did their level best to disable a number of ships right up at the end, the Hipper, to a certain extent, was salvageable. Lutzow, again, rendered inoperable but still there. Prince Eugen, obviously, still there. Emden, a couple of the light cruisers, and a number of destroyers. Whereas with the Japanese, you'd be hard-pressed to find anything you could actually sail out of port by the time of the Japanese surrender that was much bigger than a destroyer. So at least in terms of sort of major naval assets, the Germans probably had more operational at the end. Fritz Kramer asks, did the USS Robin, aka HMS Victorious, teach many valuable lessons for the British for the use of the future British Pacific Fleet when they returned in 1944? Did the US pick up on any of the lessons of aircraft plotting from the British in return, or was the act of sending her to big up the Allied war effort a waste, or did she actually perform well in just being there rather than not? So Robin-Victorious was very definitely useful in the Pacific in the period when, well, there was only one US carrier, the Saratoga, otherwise present. Now, granted, there wasn't any major Japanese attack or battle that would pitch Victorious and Saratoga against whatever was left of the Kido Butai at the time, but that's not to say that she was useless for being there, because the fact is, well, she was there, the capability was there if needed, and if she hadn't been there and the Japanese had come knocking, Saratoga's good, but one carrier hull against everything the Japanese could potentially send forward at that point is probably not a bet I'd be wanting to take. Now, in terms of who learned what, the lessons about armoured flight decks and such like were being learned largely separately through damage reports and action reports. So her presence in the Pacific specifically didn't really help that much towards that part of things. The primary lessons that were learned on both sides, for Victorious and the Royal Navy, the big lessons that were learned were obviously a fair bit of operational experience around deck parking and the use of various more modern US Navy aircraft, things like the Avengers specifically, which would stand them in good stead both for general operations when they got back into the Atlantic, because then it meant there was a trained cadre of men who could pass on lessons on how to operate these aircraft to other parts of the Royal Navy as those aircraft became operational there, which obviously then kick-started the development of those skills, which meant that when the British Pacific Fleet headed out, it had more experience than could otherwise have been possible operating those aircraft, obviously, as well as their own British-derived aircraft. But the US ideas around strike aircraft particularly were also quite valuable to the British. The flip side to that was that for the Americans, the British ideas and techniques around fighter control and direction they found were far in advance of the Americans' own ones. And in part this was doctrinal, in part this was because the Royal Navy was, especially in the early part of the war, ahead of the game compared to the Americans when it came to the technology and use of radar, and the fact that they had 2 and a bit years worth of combat experience even before Japan got involved and started the Pacific part of the war with Pearl Harbor did help with that, obviously. But it basically meant that the British, by the time Victorious pops up, have about 3 years or so of experience in not just radar-directed fighter control and coordination, but they've also done it under fire, and they've also done it when they've had to make do with relatively small numbers of aircraft whose performance characteristics do leave something to be desired. And even so, they'd managed to do a fairly creditable job there. So being able to take those lessons and then translate them into the kind of things that you could do when you're taking that kind of fine grade command and control infrastructure for your fighters and then going, right, well, how do we apply this to a couple of dozen or 3 dozen Wildcats or Hellcats? It can make a fairly substantial difference, to be perfectly honest. And this kind of control, it can't be overemphasized just how important this kind of thing is. I mean, it's an example purely within the Royal Navy, the British Armed Forces, so take it as you will, but during the Malta convoys, it was found that actually air attacks, even with a relatively small number of Fulmars and Sea Hurricanes and such, using the Royal Navy's fighter direction techniques, could be broken up quite efficiently to protect the merchant shipping. Once those carriers and a cruiser that could do that control and coordination weren't there, despite the fact that the land-based fighters from Malta were significantly more capable as individual platforms, they were nowhere near as capable when it came to actually breaking up the air attacks, and so that's when most of the merchant element of the convoy suffered quite badly. And it's a similar thing in the Pacific. You can have the world's most capable fighter, but if you lack proper command and control and coordination, then you're going to get hurt pretty badly. I mean, again, it's not a US Navy example, but the Midway's a perfect thing for that. I would probably put it to you that had the Kido Butai had British radar, air search radar, and fighter control, Midway wouldn't have turned out anywhere nearly as bad as it did for them, because they would have seen those Dauntless squadrons incoming, and they would have told some of the Zero squadrons to stay up top and tangle with them. And with the best will in the world, a Zero's probably going to win a fight with the Dauntless. So yeah, very important lessons learned on both sides. And this, to be honest, is one of the things you just have to bear in mind, especially when it comes to carriers. The Royal Navy and the US Navy, on an operational level, were perfectly happy to learn from each other. The higher-ups, depending on which particular officers you're talking about, may have been a bit more intransigent about things, but when you look at the doctrines, tactics, and technology that are available to both the Royal Navy and US Navy at the start of World War II in 1939, and when the US joins in 1941, you can see two very different lines of thinking. And when you come out the other side in 1945, you see that actually, barring a few serial numbers and a few aircraft models, a lot of the thinking has actually blended together such that you are almost looking at two sides of the same coin by the time the Japanese surrender, when it comes to comparing Royal Navy and US Navy carrier operations and tactics. Dennis Kocher asks, if the Montana-class battleships had been built by the US, do you think the US would have retained just the Montanas and scrapped the Iowas, or would they have kept both classes, or what? To be perfectly honest, I genuinely don't know. It's an incredibly difficult one, because when you look at the comparisons between the two, there are a number of advantages and disadvantages to both sides. Now, it's pretty certain the US Navy wouldn't keep both sets of ships operational, certainly as long as they did historically with the Iowas. On the other hand, the South Dakotas were kept in reserve for quite a considerable period of time, so the North Carolinas and South Dakotas probably would have been sent to the scrapyard a lot sooner, because the US Navy would have been able to deep mothball one or the other. I don't think they would have kept both of them on much at all, but when you look at the Montanas, they do offer quite a number of advantages. For one, they would have been completed basically at the end or after the end of the war, so machinery-wise, hull lifespan-wise, etc., they are a lot newer ships, so they've got a lot more longevity going for them compared to the Iowas. And fair enough, even though the Iowas weren't around for most of the Second World War, they still did see a fair bit of running around and so forth. And yeah, a year or two of war, well, that's equivalent to a lot of years of peacetime operation in terms of wear and tear on your ship. The Montanas are also much larger, which means they've got more room for adaptation, more room for refits, new stuff being added to them. One of the reasons the Iowas, for example, weren't converted into some form of half-gun, half-missile hybrid was because it was felt the hulls were a bit old, the machinery was a bit worn. With Montanas, that's not so much of a concern, and as I say, there's more space on board to actually do that. So there's that, I guess. In the purely gun form, if you look at the roles that The Iowas were used for in Korea and Vietnam, mostly gunfire support. Well, the Montanas can do that, except they can do it even better because they have superior secondary and obviously more primary battery guns. So, yeah, in those respects, they're looking fantastic. The downsides, however, is that they are bigger, therefore much more expensive to run, so you can't run as many of them for the same amount of money, which could be a problem even for the Cold War US Navy. And the biggest single thing that hangs over them, apart from the manpower and financial costs of running them, is their speed. Now, you don't need to be able to move at 33 knots to bombard a coastline, but when you're talking about the surface action groups and possibly even operating with the carriers, which the Iowas were brought back for in the 80s, then you do need the speed. At that point, then, having a quote-unquote only circa 28 knot top speed, that actually does start to count against the Montanas quite a bit. And that's when you see people probably going, well, yes, but they're slower and they cost us more to run. So to get our 300 ship Navy, it's actually faster and more efficient, and we can have more utility out of reactivating the Iowas and so forth. So that's assuming, of course, that the Iowas are still around in the mothballs. See, this is the thing. I think up until the end of the 1970s, if you've got both classes, for what they're actually ending up being used for and the proposed uses, the Montana's probably actually the better ship to have. Most of its big disadvantages, apart from sheer cost, come in when you're talking about fast operations, operating with carriers and the more modern equipment, etc., which is the 1980s Reagan reactivations. Although the flip side to that is obviously that if at some point in the late 50s, early 60s, the Montanas had been converted into part missile, part gunships, let's say their rear turrets maybe were removed and that was just turned into a big missile battery farm or something like that, then they would almost certainly be on the cards over the Iowas, because it would be much easier to refit pre-existing missile systems to the role than it would be to try and take out various old systems and box in new ones to relative degrees of efficiency, which is obviously what they did with the Iowas. So, yeah, swings and roundabouts. I honestly don't know. I could make an argument one way or the other. In a long-term thing, up until the point where they were taken out of service, I think long-term, with the benefit of hindsight, you might just about edge out keeping the Iowas. But I have a feeling, given the first 20 or 30 years of their post-war careers, I do have a distinct feeling the Montanas probably would have seen more service and been higher up the retaining list, so the Iowas might well have been off the table in deep mothballs or scrap by the time their particular sets of skills would have come more in handy. And lastly for today, Dave Collier asks, can you tell us a bit more about how the Mary Rose was found and raised? So the story of the salvage of the Mary Rose is a huge, huge endeavour that, well, to be honest, I've seen several hour-long documentaries that don't do justice to the subject. So as and when I get round to actually doing the story of the Mary Rose, well, I will do my best to work closely with the museum, obviously, and to be honest, it's probably going to be, it would have to be two parts. You can tell the story of the Tudor period of the Mary Rose. The story of the salvage and conservation is a whole other thing. It would need a completely separate video, and even then, I think I struggle to do it justice, although maybe I do better than some of the TV documentaries, at least in terms of detail. But for the quick potted history, because of where it sank in relatively shallow water at the mouth of Portsmouth Harbour, obviously in the Solent, the Mary Rose had this habit like a bad penny of popping up occasionally. The currents in and out of the harbour quite significant, so occasionally timbers would be exposed. There was a brief salvage effort in the Victorian period when it was briefly rediscovered, but the actual finding and raising of it in the modern era began back in the 60s, when two different teams decided, for completely separate reasons, that they wanted to try and find it. Now, the important thing was that at this point, the laws surrounding the protection of wreck sites of national interest, historic national interest, hadn't been passed. Those were passed in the early 70s. So the rules under which everything was being operated at that point were still kind of the semi-mercenary type of legislation that dated back several centuries to when salvage was kind of a finders keepers, first come first serve game. And there was a very real risk that if the ship was found and that location got out, anyone could just show up and start taking bits and selling them for profit. So yeah, that meant that whilst the search was ongoing, although it didn't take that long to actually work out where it was, thanks in large part to surviving Victorian charts following the previous salvage attempts, they were having to be a bit closed about where it was and what they were finding. Now, once those laws were passed in terms of protecting the site, then it was a bit easier. They could work a bit more openly and raise more funds. So they did. They got a lot more money. They were able to do some more excavations in earnest. Prince Charles got involved and, interestingly enough, actually dove on the site a number of times. And this work went on through the 70s and into the early 80s. They did want to salvage the actual hull, and spoiler, they managed to. But because of the state of the hull, it was going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. Salvaging of ancient wrecks at that point was very much a new science, especially of any substantial size. Now, Vasa had already been salvaged, this much is true. However, Vasa was A, intact, broadly, and B, largely just sitting there, so much easier to get your hands on, whereas the Mary Rose was only about 40% of it was left, and it was well and truly stuck in the seabed. So, and it had been there a lot longer, so it was going to be quite the feat to get it out. So in the end, what they had to do was dig down, excavate the whole thing, take out all the artifacts first, obviously dredging away the silt and the shells and the rock and stuff as well. But they had to take out and salvage all the artifacts that were inside the ship and immediately around the ship, or what was left of it at least. And then once all of that had been done, and well, if you've been to the Mary Rose Museum or you look at their website, and maybe you've seen one or two of the documentaries that show some of the stuff they've got behind in the warehouses, there was a lot of stuff on that ship. And some of it was quite heavy, cannons and such like. So yeah, that took a while. But then once the hull was, as best as anyone could tell, empty, they had to very carefully try and detach it from the seabed because there was a lot of clay and silt that was holding on to it with quite a bit of willpower, and trying to lift it while it was still largely stuck in place would have just ripped it apart. So once they'd managed to sort of dredge around it and support it and everything, they were then able to move towards actually getting the hull up. And to do that, after a few various arguments, they ended up settling on the solution of getting the hull up and off the seabed into a steel frame whilst it stayed underwater, and then once you have that on board, you can then put that frame into a larger frame, and that overall frame is what you can see on the screen. That's what was actually then brought up using a absolutely colossal crane on a on a big barge-boat type object called wonderfully the Tog Moor. And then once it was up and out, it was over into the the conservation centre. And yeah, I'd seen that ship probably 24 times over the years, stretching back to the late 80s. So most of the times I remember seeing the Mary Rose, when they were even letting you see it at all, it was in a big hall full of sprayers of the glycol type solution they were using to force out the seawater and preserve the ship. And it's only more recently, the last probably 4 or 5 visits I've made to the dockyard, where it's been on display as a ship that you can actually look at, and very more recently you can actually be in the same room as it, because once the spraying work had stopped for a while, it was still airlocked, and it still is airlocked to a degree, but you can now go inside the airlock, which is quite fun. The raising almost went horribly wrong. If you watch the maybe on YouTube, watch a video of the raising, you'll notice if it's a complete one, at one point there's this horrible crunch crash sound, and the top of the frame actually shifts considerably because something broke. It came within a very short distance of crushing a significant part of the hull after 500 plus years underwater, but fortunately it didn't. So yeah, that's a very, very short potted history of the Mary Rose, but something that definitely needs a lot more attention in the future. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Just a few bits of channel admin before everybody runs away. So for the Thunderchild posters, I'm begun to receive a few comments from people saying that some of them have begun to arrive. Not that many, but some. So hopefully that's the leading edge of a much larger wave, and hopefully you will all be receiving those over the next week or two. Fingers crossed. If you have purchased one and you're a little bit concerned about the length of time it's taking, please do let me know via Etsy, and I'm happy to send you a digital copy as well. Since you've been kind enough to purchase a physical copy, which hopefully will stand you in good stead until your physical copy arrives. I think, given this particular experience, I think any further merchandise is either going to have to wait until the end of this lockdown, or at least the end of this lockdown's effects on the postal system, or else I'm going to have to go purely for the international tracked and signed options on postage. I did try and put the more reasonably priced international standard postage and tracked and signed on Etsy, but for whatever reason it didn't want to let me do both. It forced me to choose one or the other, and I was trying to be as kind to people's wallets as possible and chose the international standard option, which has one of the brightest points of not costing more than the price of the actual poster. But, well, we've all seen how that worked out. So, yeah, I'll have to think about that. Either have to go with tracked and signed only, or wait, one or the other two. But we'll see how it all goes anyway. Other than that, for those of you who were there for the live stream I tried to do Friday, I apologise for the technical issues again. It seems that YouTube is determined to see that I don't get a single complete live stream done. I have no idea why, but the first lot was beset by various issues with wireless communications and the limited powers of the technology I was using. We tried to solve all of those. We had microphones sorted, we had cameras sorted, we had got a new laptop, so the processing power was there. And then, for reasons completely unknown, the Wi-Fi decided to bug out, and then YouTube decided to start bugging out, despite the fact I went got a 50-meter Ethernet cable and made sure that I definitely had a hard line into the net. But who knows? So probably won't be a live stream this Friday, but maybe the one after. A few people have asked me to do another Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts live stream and maybe take a few ships into battle whilst answering questions. So yeah, I might do that. Certainly do a little bit more of a building exercise see how it's going with the latest patches, see what else we can put out there, and yeah, let's see how that goes. And one last thing, there will be over the next few weeks, I think there'll be a number of small quickfire competitions. I'll probably be running via Twitter. Obviously, I'm Drachinifel on there as well. And those will be just little giveaway things. I'll just probably post a cryptic question or a picture that identify this or something, and effectively first answer gets a prize. So I'll try and do that, keep everyone entertained, maybe every few days over the next couple of weeks. So other than that, thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are, and I shall see you again in another video, hopefully. Bye.